The moment my father said I would always be a useless daughter, the judge suddenly stared at me and asked, "Miss, are you really the woman behind that anonymous identity?" Before we continue this story, take a moment to check in down in the comments. Where are you watching this video from today? We'd truly love to see how far this story has reached and which corner of the world you're joining us from. And don't forget to subscribe so we can continue bringing you powerful stories filled with inspiration, emotion, and meaningful life lessons that stay with you long after the video ends. The freezing rain hit the thick glass of the office window, sounding like a handful of gravel thrown against the pane. It was a bleak Tuesday night in November. Down below, the narrow cobblestone streets of our small town were completely empty. The streetlights flickered, casting long pale shadows over the cold gray river that cut through the valley. This was the kind of harsh European winter that soaked right through your heavy wool coat and settled deep in your bones. I sat alone on the fourth floor of the Vance Logistics headquarters. The office was quiet. The only sound was the low, steady hum of the central heating and the rapid clicking of my mouse. A half-empty cup of black coffee, long gone cold, sat perfectly aligned next to my keyboard. It had been 6 months since I packed up my quiet, independent life in the capital and took the train back to this freezing town. I came back for one simple reason. Henrik Vance, my father, called me. My father's logistics empire was bleeding out. They had bought too much industrial land, signed too many high-interest commercial loans, and completely ignored the necessary compliance laws required by the European Union. They were drowning in their own aggressive ambition. Henrik told me he just needed me for 6 months. He needed my brain to restructure the debt and save the family legacy from bankruptcy. So, I came back. I worked 16-hour days, completely untangling the massive, suffocating mess. I renegotiated terrible vendor contracts. I pulled 3 massive commercial loans back from the absolute brink of default. I built a functioning, profitable machine out of the rusted scrap metal they handed me. For a brief, naive moment, there was calm. The company was stabilized. The banks were happy. The local business council was breathing a sigh of relief. But sitting in the dark office, I realized the bitter truth of my existence here. I was the ghost in the machine. My brother Felix was the crown prince. He was Henrik's chosen heir. Felix had the charm, the expensive tailored suits, and the perfect smile that made the local bank managers trust him over a long, expensive lunch. Felix was born to stand in the spotlight on the podium. I was born to sweep the floor beneath it. I used to think my father resented me simply because I was a woman. I thought he looked past me because I didn't fit the traditional mold of a ruthless male executive that this old money town respected. I spent my entire life desperately craving his validation. I worked twice as hard, got the highest degrees, and built a flawless professional reputation in the city, all in the pathetic hope that one day Henrik would look at me and say I was enough. But tonight, staring at the glowing computer screen, the psychological fog finally lifted. My father did not hate me. He actually relied on me to survive. He desperately needed my sharp analytical brain to keep his empire from collapsing under the weight of Felix's extreme incompetence. What Henrik truly, deeply despised was my independence. He hated that my talent existed entirely outside his direct control. He wanted to own my mind the exact same way he owned those massive logistics warehouses out on the highway. I rubbed my tired eyes and clicked open a new folder on the server. I was doing a final routine audit of the month's outgoing expenses. Everything was supposed to be clean. But then I saw an anomaly. It was a file buried deep inside a subfolder labeled Miscellaneous Land Prep. I frowned, leaning closer to the monitor. I opened the digital routing log. My blood ran completely cold. It was a formalized certificate of environmental compliance for the massive Riverside expansion project. I knew that specific piece of land intimately. It was a toxic nightmare. It was an old chemical dumping ground that required millions of euros in mandatory environmental cleaning before a single brick could legally be laid. If the chemical seepage reached the nearby river, the resulting government fines would instantly bankrupt the company. The document on my screen falsely stated that all preliminary soil cleaning had been successfully completed according to strict EU environmental standards. And sitting right at the bottom of that fraudulent, highly illegal document was a bright, perfectly rendered stamp. It was my verified digital signature. My stomach violently twisted. The air in the room suddenly felt too thin to breathe. I checked the timestamps. The system recorded that I had personally reviewed and approved the toxic site clearance at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night 2 weeks ago. I had never even opened that project folder. I had never seen this invoice in my life. I started digging deeper into the server, my hands physically shaking over the keyboard. I pulled up the external financial partner logs. There it was. My signature was stamped across dozens of expedited payments to random subcontractors that completely bypassed my department. They were using my clean, unblemished professional name as a bulletproof shield to push through illegal documents. I didn't wait. I hit print. I grabbed the warm papers from the machine, walked down the dark, carpeted hallway, and pushed open the heavy oak door to Felix's corner office. Felix was still there, pouring himself a glass of expensive whiskey from his private cart. His tie was loosened, and he looked perfectly relaxed. I dropped the printed logs flat on his glass desk. The loud smack made him jump slightly. I demanded a full, independent forensic audit of the entire payment system right that second. Felix did not even flinch. He looked down at the papers, took a slow sip of his whiskey, and let out a soft chuckle. "It's just a system glitch," Felix laughed dismissively, tossing his heavy gold pen onto the glass desk. He looked at me like I was a hysterical child overreacting to a spilled glass of water. "The new software migration has been a mess, Clara. The system must have automatically populated your signature block during the server transfer. Relax. Go home and get some sleep." I stood perfectly still. The silence in the room was deafening. I looked at his arrogant, relaxed face, and the final piece of the trap clicked into place inside my mind. I stared at him. "No system glitch forges wire transfers to unvetted shell companies at 2 a.m, Felix." I didn't say the words out loud. I didn't need to. I saw the slight, nervous twitch at the corner of his left eye. He was lying, and he knew that I knew. This was no longer a story about a narcissistic father refusing to share the spotlight, or a lazy brother cutting corners to look successful. This was a fully realized, meticulously planned criminal conspiracy. They knew the Riverside project was a toxic time bomb. They had intentionally designated me as the clean face of their most dangerous illegal gamble. They were quietly building an airtight paper trail that pointed directly to my desk. When the government environmental regulators finally arrived with their testing kits, Henrik and Felix would simply walk away. They would hand the authorities my digitally signed compliance certificates. They would play the tragic victims of a rogue, unstable daughter who had hidden the truth from her own trusting family. The brief calm was over. My world was completely destroyed. They didn't bring me back to save the family. They brought me back to be the scapegoat. Before Felix could spin another ridiculous lie about software glitches, the heavy oak door of the office swung open. Henrik walked in. My father always knew exactly how to enter a room. He wore a flawless, bespoke charcoal suit that draped perfectly over his shoulders. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his posture was rigidly straight. He carried the quiet, undeniable authority of an old-money European patriarch. He didn't need to raise his voice to make people hold their breath. His mere presence demanded absolute submission. Henrik closed the door behind him with a soft click. He looked at the printed server logs scattered across the glass desk. Then, he looked at Felix's pale, nervous face. And finally, his cold blue eyes settled on me. He didn't ask what the documents were. He didn't ask why I was breathing so heavily, or why my hands were clenched into fists. He simply wanted the conflict to end, so his perfect machine could keep running. "Felix," Henrik said softly, his tone completely flat. "Leave us." Felix didn't hesitate. He grabbed his suit jacket and practically fled the room, closing the door quietly behind him. We were alone. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I waited for Henrik to explode. I waited for him to deny everything, to yell at me for digging into the company's restricted servers, but Henrik did not yell. Instead, he walked over to the leather chair opposite the desk and sat down slowly. He let out a long, heavy sigh, rubbing his temples like a deeply exhausted old man. When he looked up at me, his eyes were unexpectedly soft. It was a look of pure paternal vulnerability. "You are angry, Clara," Henrik began, his voice smooth and soothing. "And you have every right to be. This expansion, it has been chaotic. Felix is sloppy. He pushes too fast, and he doesn't understand the fine print the way you do." I crossed my arms, refusing to let my guard down. "He didn't just push too fast, Father. He forged my digital signature on a federal environmental clearance. That is a crime." Henrik nodded slowly, acknowledging my words without actually validating them. "I know, and I have reprimanded him severely. But Clara, look at what you have achieved here in just 6 months." He gestured toward the glowing city lights outside the window. "You saved this company. You untangled the loans. You did the impossible. I have been blind to your true potential for far too long." My heart gave a stupid, involuntary flutter. "I brought you back here because I thought you could just organize the paperwork," Henrik continued, leaning forward, his eyes locking onto mine. "But you are a brilliant strategist. You have a mind for business that Felix will never possess. So, I am making a change." He reached inside his leather briefcase and pulled out a sleek, dark blue folder. He placed it gently on the glass table and slid it toward me. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "It is your future," Henrik said, offering a warm, proud smile. "It is an agreement for permanent equity in the Vance Logistics empire. I am giving you a real structural stake in the company, a permanent seat on the executive board. You are no longer just an employee, Clara. You are a partner. You earned it." For one brief, agonizingly foolish second, the heavy armor I wore around my heart cracked completely open. The cold, logical part of my brain went completely quiet. A rush of pure, desperate hope flooded my chest. He finally sees me, I thought. After 41 years of sweeping the floors for the Golden Boy, after a lifetime of feeling invisible, my father was finally handing me the crown. I was finally enough. I reached out with a trembling hand and opened the dark blue folder. I started reading the top page, then the second. I read the legal definitions, the asset allocations, and the specific liability clauses. The warm rush of hope vanished. The blood completely drained from my face, leaving me freezing cold. This was not an equity agreement. It was a personal financial guarantee. It was explicitly attached to the Riverside expansion, the exact same toxic waste site where they had forged my signature just 2 weeks ago. The document was carefully drafted to look like a promotion, but hidden deep in the legal terminology was a lethal trap. By signing this paper, I would legally bind my personal bank accounts, my future wages, and my entire professional livelihood to cover the millions of euros in potential environmental fines if the corporate funds ran dry. He wasn't giving me a reward. He was tying a heavy stone around my neck and preparing to throw me into the river. I looked up from the paper. Henrik was still smiling that warm, paternal smile, waiting for me to sign my own death warrant. The bitter reality of the corporate world, entirely wrapped in the suffocating grip of patriarchy, washed over me. In old European families like ours, the rules were never written down, but they were carved into the stone foundation of the house. The son inherits the kingdom, no matter how stupid or careless he is. The daughter cleans up the mess, takes the blame, and is expected to do it with a grateful smile. The word family was not a bond of love. To Henrik, family was merely a skeleton key. It was a psychological weapon he used to unlock my loyalty and steal my future. "This is a liability transfer," I said, my voice completely hollow. "You want me to personally guarantee the toxic waste fines." Henrik didn't flinch. The warm smile faded, replaced by the cold, calculating mask of a CEO. "It is a temporary measure, Clara. The banks require a clean guarantor to meet the quarterly deadline. Felix's credit is currently overextended. It is just a formality. If the environmental agency finds the chemical seepage, I will go to prison," I said, staring directly into his eyes. "You want to use my clean name to protect your dirty land." Henrik stood up. The illusion of the loving father evaporated completely. He stepped forward, invading my personal space. His broad shoulders blocked the light from the window. When he spoke, his voice dropped into a heavy, dangerous, commanding register that echoed in the quiet room. "Do not act like an outside lawyer," Henrik said, his words dripping with dark warning. "You are family." There it was, the ultimate manipulation. He demanded the brilliant expertise of a high-paid corporate lawyer, but he expected the blind, unquestioning obedience of a silent daughter. I looked at the expensive gold pen resting on the document. I looked at the man who shared my blood, realizing with absolute clarity that he would gladly watch me burn to save a few acres of poisoned dirt. I smiled faintly. But inside my chest, something slowly died. I didn't argue. I didn't scream or throw the papers at him. I simply turned my back on him and walked out of the office, leaving the pen untouched. Their retaliation was incredibly swift and absolutely brutal. When I arrived at the corporate building the next morning at 8 o'clock, the freezing rain was still falling. I walked up to the heavy glass security doors, shivering in the damp cold, and swiped my ID card. Beep. The small light on the scanner flashed a solid, unforgiving red. The glass doors remained locked. I tried again. Red. The security guard sitting at the front desk, a man who had cheerfully said good morning to me every day for the last 6 months, suddenly looked down at his shoes, entirely avoiding my eyes. I walked back to my car in the rain. I tried to log into the virtual company server from my mobile phone. My administrative access credentials had been completely wiped. The screen simply read, "Access denied." 10 minutes later, as I sat in my freezing car trying to process the shock, a man in a black raincoat tapped on my window. It was a private legal courier. He didn't speak. He just handed me a thick, waterproof envelope and walked away. I tore the envelope open. Inside was a comprehensive severance package drafted by Henrik's expensive lawyers. The terms were sickening. If I wanted to receive a pathetic 2 months of basic living expenses, I had to sign a clause explicitly admitting to severe administrative errors and gross negligence in the compliance department. Furthermore, the package included an ironclad non-disclosure agreement, a gag order. They were trying to force me to purchase my own silence by signing a false confession. If I signed it, I would willingly hand them the exact loaded gun they needed to blame me for the environmental fraud. I sat alone in the cold car, gripping the steering wheel as the rain hammered against the roof. I had no job, no access to the servers, and zero income. The brief calm was a lie. The hope was a trap. The mental slaughter had officially begun. The execution of my character did not happen in a courtroom. It happened in the quiet, cobblestone squares of our town. It happened over expensive cups of espresso at the local cafes, in the aisles of the upscale grocer, and in the hushed, velvet-lined hallways of the elite country club. Henrik did not need to shout to destroy me. He possessed a weapon far more lethal than anger, the quiet, devastating power of a disappointed father's whisper. Within 48 hours of my exile from the company, a single, perfectly synchronized narrative flooded the streets. Henrik and Felix seeded the story with surgical precision through their vast network of high society friends and local politicians. I experienced the fallout immediately. I walked into the local bakery on a Thursday morning. The warm smell of fresh bread usually brought me comfort. But the moment I stepped inside, the lively chatter died instantly. The baker's wife, a woman who had known me since I was a child, looked away and pretended to wipe down the counter. Two women from the country club standing by the window openly stared at me, their faces twisted into masks of deep pity mixed with disgust. I bought my bread in suffocating silence and left. They didn't have to say a word. I already knew what Henrik had told them. According to the Gospel of Henrik Vance, I was dangerously unstable. He painted a masterpiece of character assassination. He told everyone that the pressure of the corporate world had completely broken my fragile mind. To make the lie bulletproof, he dragged my past into the light. He brought up my divorce from 3 years ago, framing me as a bitter, resentful woman who had never emotionally recovered. The story they swallowed whole was that I had completely botched the corporate files out of sheer hysterical incompetence, caused massive financial damage to my generous father, and then threw a pathetic tantrum when he tried to help me. I was the villain. I was the crazy daughter. And Henrik was the tragic, long-suffering patriarch who had tried so hard to save me. The social isolation brought a creeping, icy fear. I was completely cut off. Because I refused to sign their false confession and the non-disclosure agreement, I received no severance pay. My corporate bank accounts were instantly frozen. The modest savings I had brought from the city were draining rapidly just to cover my basic survival. Within 2 weeks, I had to pack my bags. I could no longer afford the elegant townhouse near the river. I liquidated the few expensive items I owned. I sold a diamond necklace my ex-husband had given me, and I pawned a vintage watch I bought with my first big corporate bonus. I didn't ask a single person in town for a loan. I refused to give my family the satisfaction of seeing me beg. I found a place to hide. It was a tiny, drafty apartment located directly above an old, independent pharmacy on the very edge of town, far from the wealthy neighborhoods. The rent was dirt cheap. The apartment was a miserable reality check. The wallpaper was peeling in the corners. The pipes groaned loudly whenever the wind blew. The smell of medicinal herbs and old dust from the pharmacy below constantly seeped through the floorboards. The central heating was practically broken. The old iron radiator only clanked and sputtered out a weak, lukewarm breath. I spent my nights shivering under 2 thin blankets, wearing my heavy winter coat inside the apartment. I ate cheap canned soup heated on a rusty electric stove. The physical cold was absolute, but the psychological fear was worse. I was a 41-year-old woman with 2 law degrees and a flawless track record in corporate compliance, now sitting in a freezing room, completely erased from the world. Then, the final blow landed. 3 weeks after I moved into the apartment above the pharmacy, my mother passed away. Elise Vance died exactly as she had lived, quietly, in the background, without making a sound. Her health had been failing for years, but the suddenness of her departure left a hollow void in my chest. Henrik did not call me to tell me she was gone. Felix did not send a text. I found out through a sterile automated email sent by the family's probate attorney. The funeral was held 3 days later at the ancient stone church in the center of town. The sky was a heavy, unforgiving gray, and a freezing rain fell in a steady, miserable sheet. I did not sit in the front pew. I did not ride in the sleek black town cars with the rest of the family. I walked the 2 miles from my apartment to the cemetery, the cold rain soaking through my dark blue suit. When I arrived at the graveyard, the burial was already underway. The scene looked like an oil painting of European high society in mourning. Hundreds of people were gathered around the open grave. The town's elite stood shoulder to shoulder under a sea of massive black umbrellas. At the very front, standing next to the polished mahogany casket, was Henrik. He was putting on the performance of a lifetime. His head was bowed, his shoulders shaking with manufactured grief. Felix stood right beside him, dutifully holding a large umbrella over his father, playing the role of the strong, supportive son holding the family together. I stood at the very edge of the cemetery, nearly 50 yards away, standing completely alone under the branches of a dying willow tree. I didn't have an umbrella. The rain plastered my hair to my face and ran down my neck in freezing streams. People began to notice me. Heads turned. The whispers started, cutting through the sound of the rain. The wealthy men in their tailored black coats and the women in their expensive mourning veils looked back at me. There was no sympathy in their eyes. There was only raw, unfiltered judgment. They looked at me like I was trash. They truly believed I was a disgrace, a hysterical woman who had ruined her own life and was now disrespecting her mother's funeral by standing out in the rain like a stray dog. I stared at the wooden casket being slowly lowered into the dark earth. I thought about my mother, trapped her whole life in a house built on lies, silently watching her husband destroy people for sport. A heavy, suffocating pressure built up inside my chest. It crawled up my throat, choking me. My vision blurred. And then, I broke. The tears came, hot and violently fast, mixing with the freezing rain on my cheeks. My shoulders shook, and a quiet, agonizing sob escaped my lips. I clamped a hand over my mouth to keep the sound from carrying across the wet grass. But I was not just crying for the loss of my mother. I was crying from the absolute, crushing horror of my reality. I looked at the sea of black umbrellas. I looked at the father who shared my blood, and the brother I had spent months trying to save. I realized, with a clarity that physically hurt, that I was entirely alone in the world. I had been publicly skinned alive. They had stripped away my career, my money, my reputation, and my dignity, and they had invited the entire town to watch me bleed out. The tears fell relentlessly. The cold bit into my skin. For 10 long minutes, I let the town see the broken, defeated woman they so desperately wanted to see. I let myself feel the absolute rock bottom of human despair. But as the priest finished his final prayer and the crowd began to slowly disperse, the tears stopped. The agonizing sorrow inside my chest suddenly burned out, leaving nothing but a vast, freezing wasteland. I wiped my wet face with the back of my numb, trembling hand. I looked at Henrik's retreating figure as he climbed into his warm, waiting car. My father thought this was the end of the story. He thought he had successfully broken my spirit. He thought starvation, poverty, and the crushing weight of social shame would finally kill my pride. He pictured me crying in my dark, drafty apartment, completely desperate for his forgiveness and a small allowance. I turned around and began the long, freezing walk back to the pharmacy. He thought I would beg. He was completely wrong. The walk back to the apartment over the pharmacy was a blur of gray slush and biting wind. By the time I climbed the creaking wooden stairs, my dark blue suit was heavy with freezing rain, and my hands were entirely numb. I pushed the door open, expecting nothing but the familiar, suffocating silence of my drafty room. But there was something on the floor. A thick, cream-colored envelope had been slipped under the door while I was at the cemetery. I picked it up. My wet fingers smeared the ink slightly, but I could clearly read the embossed crest in the top left corner. It was from the oldest, most discreet probate law firm in the city, the attorneys who handled my mother's estate. I tore the heavy paper open. There was no long, sentimental letter. There was only a brief, legally binding notice of asset transfer, a piece of paper detailing a lease for a climate-controlled storage unit on the industrial highway just outside of town, and a small, heavy brass padlock key that fell into the palm of my hand. The storage unit was registered solely in my mother's maiden name. I didn't bother changing out of my wet clothes. I grabbed my car keys, ran back down the stairs, and got into my rusting sedan. The drive to the outskirts of town took 20 minutes. The industrial park was desolate, a graveyard of concrete and corrugated metal sitting under the bleak night sky. I pulled up to the security gate of the storage facility, punched in the access code written on the attorney's letter, and drove down the long, brightly lit corridor of identical orange doors. Unit 412. I stepped out into the freezing air, inserted the small brass key into the heavy padlock, and turned it. It clicked open with a sharp snap. I grabbed the metal handle and pushed the heavy rolling door upward. The overhead fluorescent bulb flickered to life, casting a harsh pale light over the small room. I stood in the doorway, my breath misting in the cold air. I don't know what I expected to find. I thought I would see boxes of old childhood photo albums, dusty winter coats, or perhaps her extensive collection of antique Bavarian porcelain that Henrik always hated looking at. I thought this was a sentimental inheritance. There were no photo albums. There was no porcelain. The small room was stacked from the cold concrete floor to the ceiling with heavy-duty plastic bins, tightly bound banker's boxes, and 3 massive, reinforced metal filing cabinets. It was an archive. I stepped inside and closed the metal door behind me, sealing myself inside the windowless room. I walked over to the nearest stack of plastic bins. The white labels on the front were written in my mother's elegant, slanted handwriting. Vendor contracts, 2019-2021. Riverside expansion, preliminary soil analysis. Internal Treasury memos, unredacted. My hands started to shake, not from the cold, but from the massive, earth-shattering realization of what I was looking at. My mother, Elise Vance, had spent her entire 40-year marriage playing the role of the perfect, submissive European society wife. She never raised her voice at the dinner table. She never openly challenged Henrik when he verbally crushed people to get his way. She poured the wine, smiled at the country club dinners, and looked away when her husband and son destroyed the lives of the people who worked for them. Everyone in town assumed she was weak. I assumed she was weak, but she was not blind. She knew exactly the kind of monster she was married to. She understood his terrifying habit of making a promise in the morning and completely denying it by the afternoon. She knew he lived his entire life rewriting reality to suit his own selfish needs. So, in the absolute suffocating silence of her long marriage, my mother became a meticulous historian. She hoarded the truth. She kept everything, operating like a ghost in her own home, methodically preparing for the inevitable day when the actual facts would need to be proven. She didn't have the strength to fight Henrik while she was alive, so she built a guillotine for him to face after she was dead. I sat down hard on the freezing concrete floor and pulled the first box toward me. I ripped off the lid. The sheer volume of raw data was staggering. I found printed email chains dating back almost a decade. I found handwritten meeting notebooks detailing off-the-record board discussions that Henrik thought had been permanently destroyed. There were thick stacks of original commercial insurance policies and vendor contracts from before Felix had taken a black marker to the terms. Then, at the bottom of the second box, I found a small waterproof lockbox. I pried it open. Inside, resting on a bed of protective foam, were 4 external hard drives. I had my laptop in my bag. I pulled it out, set it on my lap, and plugged the first drive into the port. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. The drive contained hundreds of hours of raw audio files. They were digital recordings of internal corporate conference calls that Henrik had explicitly ordered not to be recorded. I clicked on a file dated roughly 7 months prior, right around the time the massive Riverside warehouse development was aggressively expanding. The audio crackled, and then it became crystal clear. I heard my father's voice, sharp, arrogant, and commanding. "I don't care what the environmental agency says." Henrik's voice echoed from the small computer speakers. "Push the funds through the secondary shell company. Bury the soil invoices before the auditors arrive on Monday. And use Clara's credentials for the clearance forms. She won't check." I hit pause. The silence rushed back into the cold storage unit. The tears I had shed at the cemetery just hours ago felt like they belonged to an entirely different person. The agonizing sorrow was completely gone. The crippling fear of being poor, isolated, and hated by the town simply vanished into thin air. In its place, a profound, chilling calmness settled over me. It was the birth of a terrifying, ice-cold hope. This was no longer just my word against theirs. This was not a vague, emotional dispute about a daughter being treated unfairly by a patriarchal family. This was hard, undeniable, mathematical evidence of systemic, deliberate fraud. The documents and audio files in my mother's secret vault did not just show isolated incidents of bad judgment. They formed a cohesive, undeniable pattern of criminal behavior. I could take these pieces and build a perfect three-dimensional model of corporate deception. My mother had just handed me the exact lethal ammunition I needed to tear Henrik's empire down to its very foundations. I sat in the harsh fluorescent light, surrounded by a lifetime of hoarded sins. I thought about Henrik sitting in his warm mansion tonight, drinking expensive scotch, firmly believing I was thoroughly broken. He thought I was nothing more than a casualty of his ambition. I closed the laptop gently. For 41 years, a tiny, pathetic part of me still wanted my father's approval. Tonight, sitting on this freezing concrete floor, that part died completely. I didn't sleep a single minute that night. I hauled 3 of the most crucial boxes from the storage unit into the trunk of my rusting sedan, drove back to town, and carried them up the creaking wooden stairs to my apartment. I dropped them onto the worn floorboards. War requires many things: anger, patience, and evidence. But above all, a prolonged war requires capital. Henrik had millions of euros at his disposal. He had a team of expensive corporate lawyers who specialized in starving out the opposition. He could afford to drag a lawsuit through the regional courts for years until I was completely bankrupt and living on the street. I needed a war chest, and I needed it immediately. I could not risk my father tracking my finances through the local European banking network, where his friends managed the branches. I picked up my mobile phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in 3 years. I called Matilda. Matilda was my former boss in the capital. She was a woman made entirely of sharp angles, tailored French suits, and even sharper instincts. She was a senior partner at Vanguard Special Situations, an elite, highly discreet corporate warfare outfit. They weren't standard, polite lawyers. They were the people you hired when 20 million euros vanished into the dark, and you needed a ruthless predator to rip up the corporate floorboards and find the rats. She answered on the second ring. I didn't waste her valuable time with a tearful, emotional backstory about my family's betrayal. I laid out the bare bones of my situation. "I am completely cut off, Matilda," I said, my voice steady and completely void of emotion. "I am facing aggressive legal threats, and I am currently preparing to completely dismantle a heavily entrenched local logistics monopoly from the ground up. I need remote overflow work, independent forensic contracting." Matilde let a long, heavy second pass over the line. She didn't offer a single word of easy comfort. She asked a simple, cutting question. "Do you want to be coddled, Clara, or do you want to win a genuinely difficult case?" "I want to win." "Good," she replied smoothly. "I will send you the encrypted files in an hour." I transformed my drafty, freezing apartment into a tactical forensic command center. I bought 3 cheap second-hand computer monitors and arranged them on my rickety kitchen table. I paid a massive premium to have a private, heavily encrypted internet line routed directly to the apartment, completely bypassing the local network providers that my father's country club friends controlled. My life became an exercise in extreme, punishing discipline. Every single morning I woke up at 5 o'clock in the freezing dark. I made a pot of cheap black coffee. And then I went to war. Matilde sent me massive, convoluted commercial disputes from across the continent. I audited highly toxic loan portfolios for a corrupt shipping firm in Rotterdam. I tracked hidden payment chains through dense layers of offshore holding companies for a fraudulent real estate developer in Munich. I ripped their broken financial models apart to the absolute molecular level, and I rebuilt the truth. I worked under my full legal name, Clara M. Vance. In my small judging hometown, that name meant a disgraced, hysterical daughter. But out there, in the high-stakes, ruthless world of European commercial litigation, Clara M. Vance was quietly becoming a nightmare for corrupt executives. When the sun went down, My contract work for Vanguard ended, and my personal war officially began. I turned to my mother's boxes and Henrik's stolen servers. I didn't look at Felix's forged documents and scream. I didn't throw things against the wall. Revenge is not a dramatic explosion of anger. Revenge is cold, undeniable math. Let me explain exactly what it means to analyze a corrupted payment chain in the modern European banking system. It is not just looking at a printed bank statement and searching for missing money. It is building a psychological profile of a white-collar criminal. You have to understand why a specific amount of money, say $9,999, deliberately kept just under the $10,000 automatic flagging threshold, was moved on a specific Tuesday afternoon. I spent weeks staring at glowing monitors until my eyes physically burned. I tracked phantom euros as they bounced from Vance Logistics' primary corporate treasury. I watched the money land briefly in a small, struggling landscaping company's IBAN account, acting as a blind pass-through station. From there, it was immediately wired out via international SWIFT codes to an unlisted trust account in Cyprus. I looked at the digital metadata attached to every single wire transfer. I scrubbed thousands of lines of server code to find the invisible hand pushing the button. I found the exact Internet Protocol, IP addresses. I isolated the digital footprints. I meticulously matched the timestamps of the digital signature approvals on the toxic waste documents with the physical security badge swipes at the corporate headquarters. The math was flawless. The server logs proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that my administrative credentials were manually hijacked from an internal IP address hardwired directly into Felix's private corner office. Furthermore, the logs proved this happened at the exact same moment my physical security badge was registered as being miles away from the building. They were stealing my identity from inside their own executive suite. I didn't just hoard this data. I weaponized it. I built a comprehensive, strictly color-coded physical filing system, spreading it across my living room floor. I bought dozens of heavy-duty binders. The red binders contained the irrefutable proof of the illegal cash flow and the hidden vendor payments routed to Felix's shell companies. The blue binders held the certified digital access logs, proving the internal identity theft and server manipulation. The yellow binders tracked Henrik's backdated asset transfers, the fraudulent real estate deeds he used to legally hide the clean, profitable warehouses while dumping the toxic environmental liabilities onto my name. And finally, sitting in the center of my wooden table was one single, thick, black binder. This contained the absolute kill shots. It held the unredacted audio transcripts of my father explicitly ordering the fraud, alongside my mother's hoarded original contracts. I was weaving a trap of microscopic steel threads. Henrik and Felix thought I was a broken woman crying in the dark. They had no idea I was sitting in that same dark, patiently measuring their necks for the noose. Every line of code I traced, every IP address I verified, and every bank routing number I recorded was another nail perfectly driven into their coffin. The people in the town walking on the freezing cobblestones below my window still whispered about my tragic downfall. They assumed my total silence meant I was too terrified to face my powerful family. But I no longer cared about their whispers. Public opinion is a fragile, entirely useless thing when you are holding absolute mathematical proof of a felony. I didn't need their sympathy or their understanding anymore. I had something infinitely more powerful. I had the complete, unbreakable structure of the truth, perfectly categorized by color, waiting patiently to be unleashed. The freezing rain had finally stopped, leaving the morning air sharp and brittle as broken glass. I stood at the bottom of the grand stone steps of the regional magistrate court. It was a massive, intimidating building made of dark gray stone, designed centuries ago to make ordinary citizens feel incredibly small. Today, it was the grand stage for the Vance family's public execution. Only, the town had the wrong victim in mind. I pulled a rusted metal dolly behind me. Stacked on it were 3 heavy cardboard boxes, perfectly organized and tightly sealed. The wheels squeaked faintly against the wet cobblestones. It was the only sound I made as I walked up the stairs. I wore a simple, dark blue suit, flat shoes, and absolutely no makeup to hide the dark circles under my eyes. I pulled my hair back into a severe, tight knot. I did not look like a woman begging for pity. The heavy oak double doors of courtroom number 4 swung open. The room was packed far beyond its capacity. Every single wooden bench was taken. The wealthy elites of the town, the country club gossips, and the local business council lined the back walls, standing shoulder to shoulder. The air smelled of wet wool coats and expensive perfume. They had all crammed into the gallery, eager for blood. They came to watch the great Henrik Vance finally crush his hysterical, rebellious daughter. I walked down the center aisle. I did not rush. The murmurs and whispers died down the exact second I pushed my rusty dolly past them. At the defense table sat Henrik. He wore a pristine, custom-tailored navy suit. He sat perfectly straight, his chest pushed out, owning the space like a king waiting for a peasant to kneel. Beside him sat Felix, scrolling on his mobile phone, acting completely bored. He played the part of the untouchable prince who had much better places to be, and flanking them both was their ultimate weapon, Victor Thorne. Victor Thorne was not just a lawyer, he was a corporate executioner. He charged €1,000 an hour to bury his client's enemies under mountains of expensive procedural motions. He leaned back in his plush leather chair, tapping a heavy gold pen against his legal pad. He didn't even bother to look up when I reached the plaintiff table. I was nothing to him. I was just an annoying, emotional family squabble he had to squash before his lunch reservation. I set my boxes down. The dull thud echoed loudly in the high-ceilinged room. Henrik turned his head. He looked at my damp suit and the empty chair beside me. A cruel, practiced smile stretched across his face. He leaned back and projected his voice just enough so the crowded gallery behind us could hear. "You couldn't even afford a lawyer, Clara," Henrik said, his voice dripping with mock pity. A few scattered chuckles drifted from the back rows. They were laughing with him. They were laughing at me. I didn't answer him. I simply opened the top box and pulled out my primary black binder. I laid it flat on the dark oak table. The heavy wooden door behind the bench opened, and the bailiff called the room to order. Judge Magistrate Celeste Wren walked in and took her seat. She was an absolute institution in the regional courts, a woman with iron-gray hair and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She did not tolerate time-wasters. Judge Wren looked down at me, adjusting her glasses. "Miss Vance, the court notes you do not have legal representation for this mandatory evidentiary hearing. Are you proceeding on your own behalf?" "I am, Your Honor," I replied, my voice perfectly level. "I possess the full professional licensing and state certifications to present the forensic record today." I motioned to the court clerk, handing over the thick black binder to be distributed to the judge and the defense table. The clerk walked over and placed a copy directly in front of Victor Thorne. Victor let out a quiet, dramatic sigh of extreme boredom. He reached out with his perfectly manicured hand and pulled the binder toward him. He expected a joke. He expected a messy, handwritten plea about family fairness and emotional distress. He casually flipped open the heavy black cover. I stood perfectly still, watching his hands. I watched his face. Victor grabbed the corner of the first page to turn it, but his fingers suddenly stopped. His hand froze completely in midair. His eyes darted to the top left corner of the document. Then his eyes snapped to the center, taking in the color-coded risk matrices and the complex chronological liability nodes. He recognized the surgical, highly unique formatting of the financial data reconstructions. 2 years ago, Victor Thorne had defended a massive corporate real estate developer in Munich in a €40 million bankruptcy fraud case. He had the entire trial in the palm of his hand. He was guaranteed to win. But then, the opposing counsel submitted an independent forensic analysis report that completely annihilated his aggressive defense. That report exposed his client's hidden offshore accounts with such ruthless, undeniable mathematical precision that Victor lost the case catastrophically. It humiliated him publicly and cost his prestigious firm millions. Victor had spent the last 2 years wondering who the brilliant, anonymous ghost contractor was that had slaughtered him in court. Now, his eyes slowly dragged down to the formal signature block at the bottom of the page. Clara M. Vance, Senior Forensic Analyst, Vanguard Special Situations. The remaining healthy color completely drained from Victor's face. His expensive tan seemed to wash away right there in the chair, leaving him looking like a sick, terrified old man facing a firing squad. The heavy gold pen slipped from his trembling grip. It clattered loudly onto the solid wooden table, rolling to the floor. He didn't look at the judge. He didn't look at Henrik. He slowly turned his head and stared dead at me across the aisle. His eyes were wide, filled with a sudden, suffocating panic. He realized in real time that he had arrogantly walked his clients directly into an inescapable trap set by the exact same ghost who had already defeated him once before. The courtroom was so utterly silent that Victor's panicked whisper carried clearly across the tense gap between our tables. "My God, is that really her?" It was barely a breath, but it was enough. It was everything. Henrik heard it. He frowned heavily, turning his head to look at his high-priced lawyer. For the first time in his long, arrogant life, my father saw Victor Thorne completely lose his nerve. He saw the pure, unadulterated fear radiating from the most ruthless man he knew. In that exact fraction of a second, Henrik looked from his terrified lawyer to the black binder, and then finally back to me. The triumphant, mocking smile slipped right off my father's face. I met his gaze. I did not blink. I didn't smirk. I just stood there, cold and unmoving as a statue. The elegant retaliation had officially begun, and they hadn't even realized the blade was already at their throats. I did not begin with a dramatic opening statement. I did not stand in the center of the courtroom and deliver a tearful, emotional speech about family betrayal or moral failings. The time for feelings had passed months ago. Now was the time for the blade. The town had come to this courthouse expecting a tragic spectacle. They expected a broken, hysterical woman begging the judge for a few scraps of mercy. Instead, I gave them a forensic autopsy. "Your Honor," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy, suffocating silence of courtroom number 4. "I call my first witness to the stand, Mr. Elias Vogel." Henrik's posture stiffened. Elias Vogel was the former lead systems administrator for Vance Logistics. My father had fired him without warning a month ago, blaming him for a security breach to cover their own tracks. Elias walked up to the wooden witness box, his face pale but determined. He swore on the Bible and sat down. I handed a blue binder to the court clerk to give to the judge, and another to Victor Thorne. Victor didn't even open his copy. He just stared blankly at the polished table, completely paralyzed by the realization of who I was. "Mr. Vogel," I said calmly, standing perfectly still behind my table. "Can you confirm the nature of the server overrides that occurred on the night of October 14th? Elias leaned into the microphone. "The digital security overrides were not a glitch, Miss Vance. The server logs clearly show that your administrative credentials were manually hijacked from an internal source." The gallery behind me started to murmur. Judge Wren banged her heavy wooden gavel once. "Silence in the court," she warned, her eyes fixed entirely on the blue binder. I didn't pause. I immediately called my next witness. Marcus Weber, a senior credit specialist at the Regional Commercial Bank, took the stand. He was risking his entire career by being here, but I had shown him the math, and he knew the bank was about to be federally investigated for funding a toxic waste site. "Mr. Weber," I asked, my tone purely clinical, "why did the Internal Risk Committee approve the massive, highly irregular commercial credit lines for the Riverside Expansion Project?" Marcus nervously adjusted his tie, refusing to look at Henrik. "We approved those loans specifically because your name, Clara Vance, was attached as the chief guarantor of regulatory adherence. We ignored the glaring red flags on the soil reports because your signature served as an ironclad guarantee." We trusted your professional integrity. Next was Greta Braun, the owner of the small landscaping firm. Her hands physically shook as she took the microphone. Under oath, she confirmed the blind, illegal money routing. She admitted that Felix had paid her a monthly retainer to let massive corporate funds land in her local checking account before being immediately wired out to an unlisted shell company in Cyprus. I entered her bank routing receipts into evidence. Everything perfectly locked together. The invisible, suffocating web my family thought they had so cleverly spun in the dark was now a giant, undeniable steel cage sitting directly under the bright fluorescent lights of the courtroom. The wealthy elites in the gallery who had laughed at me 30 minutes ago were now completely dead silent. The atmosphere was incredibly tense. They were watching a massacre. "I call my final witness," I announced, looking directly at the defense table. Felix Vance. Felix looked like he was about to vomit. The golden boy of the town, the untouchable prince, stood up on shaking legs. His expensive tailored suit suddenly looked far too big for him. The frozen commercial credit lines and the crushing weight of the incoming evidence had completely destroyed his nerves. He walked up to the witness box, sweat shining on his forehead. I did not yell at him. I did not pace around the room like a dramatic television lawyer. I stood completely still, holding a single printed piece of paper. "Felix," I began, my voice soft but terrifyingly sharp. "You claimed the forged environmental clearance was a software glitch, a system error." "Yes," Felix stammered, gripping the edges of the wooden box. "The servers they were migrating. It was an automated error." "Your Honor, I direct the court's attention to Exhibit C in the blue binder," I said. "These are the certified, unredacted IP server logs retrieved from the corporate mainframe." I walked forward and handed a copy directly to Felix. He stared at the glowing green text printed on the black background as if it were written in a foreign language. "Felix, read the Origin Internet Protocol address for the exact moment my signature was stamped on the toxic waste clearance," I instructed. He swallowed hard. He couldn't speak. "Allow me," I said coldly. "The IP address is 192.1168.422. Mr. Vogel has already testified that this specific address is not a random wireless connection. It is a secure, hardwired Ethernet line." I paused, letting the silence hang in the air for one agonizing second. "Felix, where does that specific Ethernet cable lead?" He shook his head, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic. I don't know computer stuff, Clara. It leads directly into the wall behind the desk in your private corner office," I stated, my voice echoing off the high stone ceiling. "And furthermore, the physical security badge swipe records confirm that my body was entirely off the premises when this happened. However, your security badge was used to enter that exact office just 10 minutes prior." I stepped closer to the stand. I boxed him into an absolute, inescapable corner. "You didn't just accidentally misplace some paperwork, Felix. You sat at your desk, logged into the system, stole my identity, and committed federal environmental fraud." Under that crushing clinical pressure, the golden boy facade shattered completely. Felix cracked. His eyes darted wildly toward his lawyer, Victor Thorne, who was staring at the floor, offering absolutely no help. Then Felix looked at Henrik. Henrik's face was a mask of cold fury, silently demanding that his son take the fall and protect the family name. But Felix was not strong. He was a coward who had spent his entire life hiding behind other people's hard work. "It wasn't my idea!" Felix suddenly screamed, his voice cracking loudly into the microphone. The sound was pathetic, high-pitched, and desperate. "I didn't want to do it. I didn't even know how to bypass the firewall." He pointed a shaking finger directly at Henrik across the room. "He made me do it!" Felix cried out, tears of sheer panic streaming down his face. "Father told me to do it. He said Clara would just clean up the administrative mess later, like she always does. He said we had the right to use her name because she owed us. He set the whole thing up to hide the toxic land. I was just following his orders." Chaos erupted. The gallery gasped collectively. The wealthy men and women who had worshipped Henrik Vance for decades stared in absolute shock as the pristine European aristocratic image of the family violently ripped itself to shreds. Henrik slammed his fists onto the table, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "Shut your mouth, you pathetic fool," he roared at his own son, completely abandoning his refined, dignified persona. "You lied to me!" Felix screamed back, weeping openly in the witness stand. "You said she would just take the blame and go away quietly." I stood perfectly still in the center of the room, watching them. The arrogant men who had casually crushed women, who had demanded my absolute obedience, and who had tried to bury me alive to maintain their flawless public empire, were now viciously tearing each other's throats out under the harsh fluorescent lights. It was the most beautiful, deeply satisfying thing I had ever seen. The heavy wooden gavel struck the sounding block with the force of a gunshot. The sharp, violent echo instantly cut through the chaotic screaming between my father and my brother. "Silence!" Judge Celeste Wren commanded, her voice booming through the microphone. Her eyes blazed with a terrifying professional fury. "One more word from either of you, and I will have you both held in contempt and escorted out of my courtroom in handcuffs." Felix slumped back into the witness chair, sobbing into his hands. Henrik stood frozen by the defense table, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like his teeth might shatter. In a standard corporate dispute, a judge would usually gather the evidence, call a recess, and retreat to her private chambers for days or even weeks to deliberate. But Judge Wren did not move from her high seat. The absolute scale of the financial fraud, the undeniably clear digital server logs, and the sheer, calculated cruelty of the family's setup were staggering. She didn't need time to think. She was ready to use the blade. She leaned forward, looking directly down at Henrik and Felix with a gaze full of absolute disgust. "I have seen and heard more than enough," Judge Wren stated, her voice cold and absolute. "I am issuing a series of immediate bench rulings. Effective this exact second, I am ordering a total, comprehensive freeze on all corporate assets, bank accounts, and real estate transfers across the entire Vance Logistics portfolio. Nothing moves." Henrik closed his eyes. The empire he had spent his life building, the kingdom he had lied and stolen to protect, was instantly locked down. "Furthermore," Judge Wren continued, picking up the forged compliance document, "I hereby legally and permanently void the personal financial guarantee bearing the forged signature of Miss Clara Vance. The plaintiff is entirely severed from the toxic environmental debt associated with the Riverside expansion project." I let out a slow, quiet breath. The invisible rope that Henrik had tied around my neck was officially cut. I was safe. I would not go to prison. I would not lose my future. But Judge Wren was not finished. She looked out over the crowded gallery. She saw the wealthy elites, the country club gossips, and the local politicians who had spent the last several months happily spreading vicious rumors about my mental stability. "Let the permanent public record reflect a vital correction," Judge Wren announced loudly, ensuring every single person in the back rows heard her clearly. "The defense has repeatedly attempted to characterize Miss Vance as an unstable, low-level employee who was merely good with paperwork. The forensic evidence presented today proves the exact opposite. Clara Vance was the chief architect of the company's compliance framework. Her structural role was a highly critical pillar of the business. Without her unblemished professional integrity, this company would have collapsed years ago." She struck her heavy wooden gavel one final time. "This hearing is adjourned. The federal authorities will be notified of the fraud admitted in this room today." The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. There were no whispers as the gallery began to empty. The suffocating silence of total, absolute defeat settled over the room. The people who had come to watch my ruin shuffled out quickly, staring at the marble floor, completely terrified that the resulting federal investigations might soon turn toward their own businesses. At the defense table, the great Victor Thorne was already packing his expensive leather briefcase. The €1,000 an hour corporate executioner didn't say a single word. He didn't offer a handshake or a strategy for an appeal. He refused to even look his ruined clients in the eye. He simply snapped his briefcase shut, turned on his heel, and practically sprinted out of the side door. I stood alone at the plaintiff table, quietly stacking my documents back into the heavy cardboard boxes. The war was over. I heard the slow, heavy scraping of shoes on the marble floor. Henrik slowly walked over to my table. I stopped packing and looked up. The untouchable titan of our town, the old-money European aristocrat who had ruled with absolute authority, suddenly looked like a very old, entirely broken man. His broad shoulders were slumped forward. The pristine, custom-tailored navy suit suddenly looked too big for his shrinking frame. The deep lines around his mouth were heavy with defeat. He looked at the massive boxes of organized evidence. Then, he looked up at me. For 41 years, I had looked at this man with a desperate, pathetic mixture of deep fear and an agonizing craving for his love. I had spent my entire life twisting myself into knots, trying to be the perfect, obedient daughter, hoping he would finally see my worth. But looking into his eyes right now, I felt absolutely nothing. The anger was gone. The deep, aching sadness of the little girl who just wanted her father's approval was completely dead. In its place was a profound, peaceful void. Looking at Henrik Vance felt exactly like looking at a stranger waiting at a bus stop. He had absolutely no power over me anymore. His voice was hoarse, stripped of all its commanding thunder, as he asked the final question. "Is this your idea of revenge, Clara?" I looked him dead in the eyes. I didn't raise my voice. I gave him the cold, precise truth. "So, no," I replied quietly. "This is the bill for all the times you confused my silence with consent." I didn't wait for his response. I turned my back on him for the final time. I grabbed the handle of the rusted metal dolly and pushed it down the center aisle of the empty courtroom. I didn't stay to claim the broken throne of his crumbling company. I didn't want a single dirty brick of his ruined empire. I pushed the heavy double doors open and walked down the wide stone steps of the courthouse. The freezing winter rain had finally stopped. The heavy, dark gray clouds that had choked the town for months were breaking apart, allowing bright, sharp columns of clear daylight to hit the wet cobblestone streets. The air was crisp, clean, and incredibly cold. I lifted the heavy cardboard boxes into the trunk of my rusting sedan and slammed the lid shut. I opened the driver's side door and slid into the cold leather seat. I shut the door, completely sealing myself off from the town, the courthouse, and the family I had just destroyed. I gripped the steering wheel with both hands. I sat perfectly still for a moment, listening to the quiet ticking of the car engine. I closed my eyes and took a deep, long breath. And then, the dam finally broke. I dropped my forehead against the steering wheel, and I began to cry. My shoulders shook, and massive, overwhelming sobs tore from my chest. But they were not tears of sorrow. They were not tears of regret or guilt or fear of the future. They were the tears of a prisoner stepping out into the sunlight after a lifetime in the dark. The immense, crushing weight that I had carried on my shoulders since I was a child simply dissolved into the air. I cried for the woman I used to be, the one who worked 16-hour days just to earn a crumb of affection from a man who was incapable of giving it. I cried for the sheer, terrifying relief of finally fighting back and winning. I wept until my lungs ached and my vision blurred, releasing every single ounce of built-up tension, betrayal, and pain. Through the tears, a genuine smile broke across my face. I had meticulously rebuilt the truth entirely by the book. I had dismantled a corrupt local dynasty. Most importantly, I had finally killed the suffocating shadow of Henrik Vance that had haunted my entire life. The shadow was completely dead. I wiped my wet cheeks, turned the key in the ignition, and drove away from the courthouse. For the first time in 41 years, I was entirely free. Sometimes, The hardest reality of life is realizing that the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones you need protection from. Clara's journey reminds us that our silence should never be mistaken for consent, and our worth is never defined by the shadows of others. You are stronger than the expectations placed upon you. If you found a piece of your own strength in this story, or if you are still fighting to find your voice in the dark, know that you are not alone. Subscribe to Reality of Life, leave a like, and share your own story in the comments below. When was the moment you decided to take your power back? Let's build a community of survivors. Hit the notification bell, and remember, no matter how dark it gets, you have the power to write your own ending.